One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, we're back with another episode, and I really just want to, from my heart, thank you guys for listening. It's not always an easy thing to make sure that I get content out on a consistent basis, between my clinical practice and my teaching part of my career and traveling through 2 different countries and lots of different states in the U.S. to see my family, my kids, my grandkids. Sometimes time gets a little bit short. So I really do appreciate you guys tuning in on a consistent basis. So today we're moving on to the next item in the functional hierarchy of health, and that is lipid control and the risk for cardiovascular disease. And that's going to put cholesterol front and center of the conversation. But to be honest, it's almost an episode that I don't want to do. I mean, I do, but there are some issues. Like on one hand, the topic of high cholesterol and its potential link to heart disease and stroke it's so emotionally charged that, sometimes I would almost rather stay out of it. But it is an important topic. And so on the other hand, when it comes to health and wellness, there's perhaps not many other topics that are perhaps more misunderstood or misrepresented in healthcare. So on one hand, I kind of feel like I have to jump in and do the best that I can to try to sort out some of the confusion, perhaps diffuse some of the emotionality, and present some common sense thoughts and perspectives. So let me start with this idea that the topic of high cholesterol is emotionally charged. And honestly, that's with both healthcare providers as well as people like you if you're a healthcare consumer. First of all, among conventional doctors, the prevailing thought is that high cholesterol causes heart disease, and that the best option to change that is a prescription of a statin drug. And in some cases, it's a fervent belief that sometimes maybe borders on unquestionable dogma. And advocates of this position like to say that, since the first statin drug became commercially available back in 1987, that the death rate from heart disease has come down. And so they use that as their argument and rationale very clearly. Heart disease was high and we started statin drugs, and now it's deaths from heart disease are lower. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But for now, what I want you to know is that statement is really only partially true. And the grain of truth that's in that statement, for me at least, isn't really enough to conclude that statins save lives and is the holy grail of heart disease. And I shouldn't say that it doesn't save lives, but the question is, how many lives do statin drugs actually do save? And I also want to be very clear that I am not a prescribing physician. I'm not trained in pharmacology. I don't do drugs and surgery. I'm a natural medicine doctor. So you might argue, well, why should I listen to you? This is outside your scope of practice. Well, listen, human physiology is not outside the scope of my practice. Health and wellness is not outside the scope of my practice. I chose a different route. I certainly could have gone to medical school, but that wasn't aligned with my value systems. What I believe to be true in most cases is that natural medicine and natural medicine approaches, and I'm not using natural medicine to refer to just strictly use of nutrients or herbs to heal conditions or to improve health. I'm talking about natural medicine as a framework and approach that includes not just nutritional supplementation, but diet and exercise and so on. So I certainly could have gone that route, but I chose not to because my beliefs lie elsewhere. But let me get back to this idea that so many doctors believe that statins are kind of like the holy grail for fixing the problem of heart disease, but more particularly death from heart disease. This belief persists. It is deeply entrenched. In fact, I remember a relatively recent conversation with an extended family member who was a hospital administrator. He's retired now. He's still alive, but a hospital administrator. And he said to me one day that his cardiologist told him that if he took a statin every day, even though he didn't have high cholesterol, he said, if you take a statin every day, I'll only ever see you in my office, and I'll never see you in the emergency room or on the operating table. That's what he told him. At least that's how he related to me. And if you think about it, that's a very strong position to hold, that taking a statin drug will, without any doubt, prevent a heart attack. It's a very strong position, but it's a wrong position, as hopefully I'll be able to lay out for you as we go through this episode today. There's a study that came out back in 2009 that showed that 75% of people in the hospital for heart attacks had normal cholesterol. And there was a major meta-analysis published in 2019 by The Lancet, which is one of the top medical journals in the world. And that study, that meta-analysis, showed that people on statin drugs die of heart-related events at almost exactly the same rate as people not on statin drugs, and that's regardless of age. Now, if you don't know what a meta-analysis is, this is a research approach that essentially summarizes all of the quality studies done by other people over a period of many years. Essentially, it's a study of multiple previous studies to weave them all together into some kind of a big picture overview. And in this meta-analysis, the study, which looked at data from, I think it was about 186,000 people in 22 different large-scale studies, it did indeed show that as a group, people on statin drugs died less than those not on statin drugs. That's the grain of truth. But get this, the difference between the two groups was only 0.2% across all ages. That's 0.2% of a difference between lives saved when you take a statin versus when you don't take a statin. So the next time you hear anyone say that statin drugs significantly decreases your risk of heart disease, you'll know that either they are massively uninformed, or perhaps they're deceived themselves, or, worst case scenario, they're intentionally misrepresenting the truth, which is probably not often. But there is a word of caution here. Although the total risk reduction is minuscule, taking a statin drug gives you an advantage of 0.2% or 0.2%. So that's across the entire population, say, of the industrialized world where these medications are being used predominantly. That's still more dead people than anyone wants to see, right? So I get that. I get that when you express things in percentages and apply those percentages over large numbers of people, it's still a lot of people that end up dying. So to be fair, again, very small percentages add up to a lot of people dead when those percentages are applied across, say, the globe or most of the globe. But when you take this population level data and you apply it down to an individual such as yourself, do the numbers add up to the point where you should consider going on a statin drug if you, for example, have high cholesterol? Well, let me ask you this. If your MD ran some labs and checked your cholesterol and says, hey, I want you to go on a statin drug to lower your cholesterol because it's going to reduce your chance of dying of a heart attack, and then he tells you that this magic statin pill will reduce your risk of death by only 0.2%, would you take it? Now, I don't know about you, but that's a very small benefit. It's not like statin drugs come without potential side effects. And remember, I'm not a prescribing physician, and I'm certainly not telling you to take or not take any drugs, any medications. Again, that's not my point. This is all about information and education, so you can make informed choices and you can see things clearly and for what they are. You can go to any drug database and look up the side effects, potential side effects of statin drugs. I like to use a website called rxlist.com, and you'll see a list that reads something like this: that common side effects of statin drugs include headaches, diarrhea, nausea, fever, vomiting, constipation, rash, upset stomach, and flatulence. But then there's a list of potentially serious side effects that include extreme muscle pain, including rhabdomyolysis, which is intense muscle damage, and possibly serious liver problems. I know, and I don't give you that list to scare you. You can go to pretty much any drug database, look up almost any drug, and you're going to see similar type potential side effects. It doesn't mean everyone who takes these drugs are going to get those things, but some will. Now, recently there have been articles written debating the idea that statin drugs cause muscle damage and pain. And they state that there's little research to support that. But it doesn't take too long just simply asking around people that you know, assuming that you're of a certain age. It's not hard to find people that you know who will testify their own experience of going on a statin drug, experiencing aches and pains in their muscles, perhaps even having laboratory evidence of muscle damage with elevated creatine kinase enzymes, only to have all that disappear when they go off the statin drug. It's pretty easy to find people who will tell you that's exactly what happened to them. But here's part of the problem. Not only has the medical community bought into statins lock, stock, and barrel, we as a society have been trained to panic at the thought of high cholesterol. It's really, at this point, it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction. And I remember working with a lady about 12 years ago. I was doing a report of findings. I was going through blood test results with a new client. And I was explaining to her that I had some preliminary data that suggested that she might have multiple sclerosis. And so what was on the table was neurological autoimmunity. And you know, these things obviously are lifelong conditions. And with autoimmune reactivity, we may have more or less success depending on the tissue that's being targeted, and ideally, mostly from the person and the choices that they make from that point forward. But that's what was on the table, was, hey, like, you might have MS. And when I paused to let her ask questions, she looked at me and she said, "How's my cholesterol?" And I was like, at the time, I was thinking, wow, like, you know, talk about missing the forest for the trees. And to be honest, I find myself routinely having to have what I call the cholesterol myth conversation, which has several parts to it. And I got that phrase, the cholesterol myth, actually from a book that was published, well, I'm going to say probably about 20 years ago now. A cardiologist, I think, I'm pretty sure he's retired now, Stephen Sinatra, medical doctor, co-wrote this book, and I can't remember the name of the other guy, but he wrote this book called The Cholesterol Myth. And in that, he looked at current and available evidence of what causes heart disease and statin drugs and cholesterol, and kind of does a really good layman's job of debunking the idea that cholesterol ultimately is what we need to be concerned about, or that conventional medical approaches are the best way or the best option that we have. So it's called The Cholesterol Myth. I'm sure you can find it on Amazon. Yeah, and I would highly encourage you to read it. It's probably a little bit outdated at this point because it is 20 years old, but it hits the nail on the head as to what the core issues are. And so that part of it is still certainly very, very valid. So going back to this idea of the cholesterol myth conversation that I have to have with people on a frequent basis, again, there's several parts to it. The first part is to debunk the idea that statin drugs alone are responsible for the downward trend of deaths from heart disease in the last 50 years, right? There's no doubt that fewer people are dying from heart disease now than ever before. In fact, if you look at, you can go to the CDC, you can go to Our World in Data. These are great websites if you want to look at trends of different types of diseases or any different things. Like Our World in Data is an amazing website. It's got so much information. And that's from all around the world, by the way. But you can go back and there was a peak in deaths from heart disease, say between the 40s and the 50s and 60s, actually. I believe it peaked in the early 60s. So there's no doubt, again, that people are dying, fewer people are dying from heart disease than ever before. But what's interesting is that data from the CDC's own website shows that the number of deaths in both men and women from heart disease was already sharply declining during the 20 years prior to the first statin drug becoming commercially available. And what seems to have triggered that trend starting in the 1960s was the Surgeon General's report in the mid 1960s. That was back when I think it was Everett Koop was the Surgeon General. Anyways, the Surgeon General's report linked smoking to heart disease. And so not long after that, cigarette companies were required by law to put warnings on their labels. And I think it was about 1970 that tobacco ads were actually banned from television in the United States. And so that's when we saw a very sharp and steady decline in heart-related deaths. And in fact, we know that when a smoker stops smoking, the risk of death from heart disease goes down by 50% in the first year. And after about 5 years, their risk for heart disease is really not much different than someone who's never smoked. So smoking is a big deal when it comes to risk for cardiovascular disease and death from that. Well, what else happened around the same time? It was in the late 1960s and early 70s that the jogging craze began, and information about heart health and cardiorespiratory conditioning came out. So, people laced up their shoes, they took to the streets and the trails, and they started improving cardiorespiratory performance, which is measured by something we call the VO2 max. And it was in 1977 that Arnold Schwarzenegger's movie called Pumping Iron came out. And that sparked another generation, probably the same generation, of people to start resistance training. And so the 70s was a pivotal time when the interest in health and fitness came around. So we had this massive change in the number of people that were smoking or not. And we had lots of people now starting to do cardiovascular training and starting to do weightlifting. And so this trend of not smoking and doing some combination of cardio and resistance training was really the advent of an entirely new lifestyle. But obviously our modern lifestyle isn't perfect, right? And while the rates of death from heart disease have gone down in the last 50 years or so, the rates of heart disease have gone up. So we actually have more people getting heart disease, but not dying from it, right? They're living longer with heart disease. And in one sense, that's good, but heart disease is still the number one killer worldwide at a rate which is about almost double the rate of death from cancer. And perhaps what's more disturbing is that other diseases associated with and perhaps causally linked to heart disease are going up as well. And despite this larger interest in and participation of people in a generally healthier lifestyle, obesity and diabetes are on the rise. And in fact, it was, I said back in the 60s, Everett Koop was the Surgeon General. That's not true. I misspoke there. Everett Koop was the Surgeon General in 2014. He coined the term cardiodiabetes. So that was Everett Koop in 2014. And so this term cardiodiabetes is a term that started to become commonly used to describe the link between three disorders: obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. And the connection is simply the inflammatory process that's critical to each one of those different things. That's what links them together. And so, one of the things that I find very interesting about this entire story about cholesterol and heart disease is how the laboratory standards for high cholesterol have changed over the years. Like when I was in school getting my basic biomedical training in the early to mid 90s, normal cholesterol was 240. And not long after I graduated and started practicing, say the late 90s, that number was revised down to 220. And of course now pretty much everyone, like all labs are pretty standardized in this sense, that your medical doctors and labs are basically reporting that cholesterol, your total cholesterol, should be less than 200. Some people are now pushing to get that revised down to 150, theoretically, that the more people we can get with lower cholesterol, the more lives we're going to save, because cholesterol is now under control. And of course, the tool to do that is the statin drug. But remember that the trend to fewer heart-related deaths started about 20 years before statin drugs became available. It was already, deaths from heart disease were already going down. And that meta-analysis that from 2019 that I mentioned before shows a minimal reduction in death from cardiovascular disease of, again, 0.2% using statins. And that's just to give you comparative numbers, so like from what number to what number, in that meta-analysis across all ages, about 1.4% of people not using statin drugs will die over a period of 5 years, compared to people who are on statin drugs at 1.2%. So if you go from 1.2% to 1.4% down to 1.2% as a death rate between using or not using statin drugs, it's an absolute change of only 0.2%. And so again, while deaths have gone down, most attributable to less smoking, the rates of heart disease has gone up, as has the incidence of the prescription and use of statin drugs. So we have more people using statin drugs, but more people getting not just heart disease, but this syndrome of heart disease with, and most likely because of, type 2 diabetes and obesity. So explain to me again how statin drugs have saved the world. They really haven't, like not even by a long shot. In 2019, the National Institute of Health published an article which was titled "Cardiovascular Disease is on the Rise, but we know how to curb it." That's the title. And it starts out by saying that cardiovascular disease or heart disease rates have increased in the last 30 years and that we need to start doing things that we already know work to reduce heart disease. And he wasn't talking about statin drugs. He said that's to adopt a healthy lifestyle and to teach our kids early in their lives about the link between lifestyle and health, so that as they age, they're much less likely to succumb to heart disease. And it's interesting that this article also points out that Japan is one of only a few nations whose burden of heart disease has actually gone down. And the author cites the difference in healthy aging in Japanese culture compared to the United States. But let me bring you back to the 1960s for a second. Many years ago, I was doing a lecture in, I think it was North Carolina. And on a break, one of the medical doctors who was in the group, I believe he was a retired cardiologist, if I remember. I'm going back a long time, but he might have been. I know he was a medical doctor. I can't remember what his specialty was. Anyways, he approached me and said that he had a gift for me, and he asked for my address. And he said that he wanted to send me one of his textbooks from when he was a student in 1965, I think it was. And it was a laboratory diagnosis textbook, because we had just finished a conversation about using laboratory diagnosis, and it was an early version of the functional hierarchy of health that we were going through. And he just thought, hey, I'm going to send this guy this book. Well, he sent me this book, and in this laboratory diagnosis manual from 1965, normal cholesterol was anything less than 300. Now, that would be unheard of today. Like, most people would panic if their cholesterol was 295. Now, again, remember that this was a time, the 1960s, there was certainly heart disease, and there had been an explosion of I should say explosion. There had been a peak of deaths from heart disease in the 50s and 60s, let's say. So there were certainly deaths from heart disease in the 1960s, but it was also around the time that people stopped smoking in droves because of the report that came out from the Surgeon General in the 60s that said smoking is linked to an increased risk for death from heart disease. And over the next decade or two, the rate of heart-related deaths plummeted in conjunction with the number of people that stopped smoking. And remember, if you're a smoker and you stop right now, within the year, your risk for heart disease and death from heart disease goes down by 50%. And after 5 years, it's like you never smoked. So if you smoke, stop. And if you don't ever start. But what's interesting is people stopped smoking. The rates of death from heart disease went way down, but not their cholesterol levels. Right? And there was no statin drugs at that point. It was going to be another almost 30 years before the first statin drug actually became commercially available. Now, there are people that were studying statin drugs and cholesterol, and certainly since the early 1900s, and I'll probably tell the story in another episode, but in the early 1900s was really when the research connection came about that, hey, cholesterol might be a cause of heart disease. And that's a nuanced story, and I'll probably tell that in the next episode. But, while here's what we know. Smoking certainly has the potential to change how your cholesterol behaves in your body, and stopping smoking can affect the balance between what is commonly called good and bad cholesterol. But we can't say for certain that stopping smoking will necessarily change, say, your total cholesterol. It probably does in some people, and certainly not in others. But the theory is that the problem with smoking and the connection with deaths from heart disease has to do with heavy metals that are in the tobacco that get inhaled, as well as oxidative damage and a plethora of other things that really have nothing to do with cholesterol. So we can't really argue that the drop in heart-related deaths from stopping smoking was because when you stop smoking, your cholesterol goes down. I don't think we can argue that at all. So in the 1960s, normal cholesterol was 300. Death from heart disease drastically reduced as people stopped smoking, yet the cholesterol levels in what was considered normal remained much higher than it is today for quite a while. And despite lowering the upper limit of normal from, say, 300 to 285 to 240 when I was in school in the 1990s to, shortly after that, 220 to now 200, the rates of heart disease have gone up, as have the rates of diabetes and obesity. We just have fewer people dying. And yes, statin lovers, it sounds a little bit harsh, but statin lovers will say, well, that's because we're using statin drugs. I don't think the data supports that. We haven't even considered the difference between what's commonly called good and bad cholesterol yet. And that'll probably be in the next episode as well. So far, we're only talking about total cholesterol, which is the sum of what is commonly called good and bad together. But before we do that, I want you to consider this. And on March the 3rd in 2012, the FDA announced changes to the safety information on the labels of statin drugs to include the statement that there's a small increased risk of developing high blood sugar of people diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Meaning that if you already have high blood sugar and you go on a statin drug, your blood sugar could go even higher, which is not a good deal. And there is also a possibility that if you might be genetically predisposed, but you don't have high blood sugar yet, that using a statin drug could potentially increase your blood sugar and you start losing control of that. So, and in addition, the statin labels will also now reflect reports of certain cognitive effects, such as memory loss and confusion experienced by some people taking them. And of course, the announcement then said that the risk was small and should not materially affect the use of these medications. Well, if the risk was small and it's not going to affect anybody, why put the warning on the label? That would be my question, which I think is a logical question to ask. So on the one hand, we know that being a diabetic greatly increases your risk of heart disease. And since 2012, statin drug manufacturers have been compelled by law to reveal that their drugs can potentially increase the risk of developing or worsening diabetes. So I hope you see the contradiction, right? But how many of us, doctors included, read the labels and the package inserts on medications? I know some of you do, but the vast majority of us do not. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that statin drugs have zero benefit, but rather that any benefit has been greatly exaggerated. And just think about that meta-analysis that I've referenced several times, right? Only 0.2% fewer people on statin drugs died compared to non-statin users. And that means that there's an awful lot of people on statin drugs who may not need it. It doesn't help them. And that brings me to something I'd like to introduce to you, and that's a concept called the number needed to treat. Number needed to treat. This is part of pharmaceutical research. Since there are no drugs that are 100% effective, any given drug can be characterized along these lines. How many people have to take any given drug for one person to have a positive outcome? Right? The higher the number needed to treat, the less likely it is to help you as an individual person. So let me say it one more time. The number needed to treat basically describes how many people need to take a drug unnecessarily for one person to see a positive outcome. That's what the number needed to treat is. So drugs can be rated by their number needed to treat. And generally, if a drug has a number needed to treat of 5 or less, then that's considered a good medication. That means that only 4 people take that drug unnecessarily so that one person can get the benefit. That was the conclusion of a study that was published in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology in 2006, that anything less than 5 is considered a good drug. And the study suggested, again, that if a drug has a number needed to treat of 5 or less, then there's a higher probability of a meaningful benefit for any individual taking the drug. But that if the number needed to treat was 15 or more, then it was quite certain to be associated with, at most, a small net health benefit. Remember, the number needed to treat, the higher the number needed to treat, the more people take it unnecessarily and with zero benefit so that one person can get the benefit. We want the number needed to be to treat to be at least 15, better yet 5 or less. So what is the number needed to treat for statins? Remember, we want low numbers. Less than 5 for sure, probably better. Less than 15 for sure, better than that. We want it less than 5. So the number needed to treat depends on the population. So it really depends on if you already have heart disease and are on a statin or go on a statin, or if you have no prior history, but now you've been diagnosed and you go on a statin, or if you don't have heart disease and you have very low risk for heart disease. So there's kind of 3 different populations to look at, because the number needed to treat is going to change depending on if you already have heart disease or not. So get this, among people with known heart disease, the number needed to treat for statin drugs is 83. 83. That means that 82 people on statin drugs get no benefit at all, and only 1 in those 83 people taking statins who already have known heart disease prevent a fatal heart attack. 1 in 83. So 82 people, it's really not helping them at all. And what's worse is that the flip of the number needed to treat is the number needed to harm. So that's kind of like the opposite. Like, how many people run the risk of experiencing a side effect and not get the benefit? And so with this group among people who have known heart disease is that they have a 2% chance that people not benefiting from the statin drug will develop diabetes. Listen, that's 10 times the relative risk reduction that we saw in the meta-analysis. Like, in other words, of 83 people with known heart disease taking statin drugs, 82 of them don't benefit at all, and perhaps 2 of those 83 people may actually get diabetes as a result of the statin drug they're taking. So one person doesn't have a heart attack, 2 people get diabetes, and the other 80 get no benefit whatsoever. And about 8 of those 80 who didn't have a heart attack or get diabetes may actually experience muscle pain and muscle damage from the drug itself. So you see, it's not as cut and dried as everything has been made out to appear. Well, what about the number needed to treat for those who have no prior history but do now have heart disease? Well, the number needed to treat in someone newly diagnosed with heart disease is 104. Not 15, not 5, 104. So 103 people take the drug with no benefit and at risk of the side effects, so that one person doesn't have a heart attack and die. Anytime you take drugs with numbers that high, you're betting against the house, so to speak. You're basically saying, I'm willing to risk that I'm that one person in 104 who's not going to die of a heart attack, as opposed to someone who's not going to get a benefit, or worse, someone who's going to experience the side effects. And the numbers are higher among people who are generally healthy and are at currently low risk for taking I'm sorry, low risk for dying from a heart attack. And listen, we're in an era now where doctors are prescribing statin drugs preventively. Okay, you have no risk factors, but your cholesterol is a little high. Let's get you on a statin. That is happening. And in fact, I think there are some kind of crazy groups that in the past have said we should be giving statin drugs to children of parents who have heart disease to prevent heart disease in those children as they grow into adults. I mean, I appreciate the fact that they're trying to prevent things way ahead of time, but their methodology is questionable. So what is the number needed to treat? Let's say that you have no diagnosable disease, you're not on any medications, but your cholesterol is higher than your medical doctor likes to see, and you go on a statin drug to prevent heart disease. The number needed to treat in that group is 217, which means that out of every 217 healthy people taking statin drugs for prevention, only one will actually prevent a heart attack, and it's not even a fatal heart attack as in the other groups. They just have a heart attack, but they die, or I'm sorry, they don't die. Of course, heart attack is nothing to sneeze at. That's not my point. It means that 216 people get zero benefit, and a portion of those people run more risk of getting the side effects than any benefit that they could ever get from taking the statin drug. So I think, what do these ridiculous number needed to treat numbers tell us? Well, we're barking up the wrong tree with trying to drive cholesterol lower and lower and lower with statin drugs. Fewer people are dying of heart disease, certainly, than 50 years ago. But it's not from statin drugs. Maybe statin drugs have contributed small amounts to that total reduction. The vast majority of the reduction comes from people not smoking and starting to adopt healthier lifestyles. So I think we're barking up the wrong tree in trying to get trying to use statin drugs to get cholesterol under some perhaps arguably questionable upper limit. So what's your best strategy? Well, stop smoking. Never start if you don't smoke now, just don't start. And if you do smoke, then guys, come on, you got to stop. Like it's not, I don't care. Like if it's a coping mechanism, there's other ways to relax that are much healthier for you. Like just don't smoke. So quit, 50% reduction of death from heart disease in 1 year. That's massive. Stop smoking, never start. Number 2, control your blood sugar, which has a lot to do with your diet, your muscle mass, your daily activity, your weekly exercise. And, and if you're heavier than you should be, then you have to do everything you can to lose the extra body fat. And I know that that's a simple thing to say. And for some of you, you can't lose weight. You can't lose body fat, even with diet and exercise. I get it, right? I've got a whole series on why that might be in previous episodes. But, in essence, if you pay attention to every aspect of the functional hierarchy of health, when you step back and look at the real risk factors that drive cardiovascular disease risk, they all boil down to everything that we've been talking about in this mini series. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about what we know about different types of cholesterol. We'll talk about how cholesterol research got started, this idea of cholesterol causes heart disease. We'll probably talk about what lab tests are really the most revealing for us. But understand that, whatever lab test you run should never be viewed in isolation, right? If all we do is measure one thing like a lipid test to make all our decisions on our total cholesterol, we're really not honoring the integrated nature of human health and looking at things as if they are multifactorial, which they certainly are. And I want to leave you with this. Don't forget that patients are people. And there is this population level data that sometimes just doesn't translate to individuals. And you are an individual, and your cholesterol level and getting that under a magic number is not the holy grail, right? As early as 1959, experts were talking about the impact of diet, mental stress, obesity, a sedentary lifestyle, and smoking as the major risk factors for heart disease. Yet a recent study shows that only 50% of doctors prescribing statin drugs for their patients even ask if they smoke, right? If they smoke, or even fewer actually talk about things like diet and lifestyle and exercise. Let me leave you with a quote from Sir William Osler, who is a pretty famous British medical physician. He said, "The good physician treats the disease, but the great physician treats the patient who has the disease." All right, guys, we'll talk to you next time. Thanks for listening.